In 1877, a man died in New York City holding $100 million. That's $3 billion in today's currency, controlled by one person, built from nothing. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. They called him the Commodore. He had started with a ferry boat. By the time his heart stopped, he owned the railroads that connected America. But on his deathbed, Cornelius Vanderbilt did something unusual. He gave his son a warning, not advice, a warning. "Any fool can make a fortune," he told William Henry Vanderbilt. "It takes a man of brains to hold onto it." 8 years later, that warning would be ignored, and within 96 years, the Vanderbilt fortune would be gone, not reduced. Gone. This is the story of how the richest family in America made one compassionate decision that destroyed everything their patriarch had built. How kindness became the weapon that killed a dynasty. And how the grandest mansions in New York became monuments to a single, irreversible mistake. Cornelius Vanderbilt was not born into wealth. He was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a ferry operator. No inheritance, no education past age 11, nothing handed to him. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother and bought a small sailboat. He used it to ferry passengers and cargo across New York Harbor. He worked the boat himself, slept on it, underbid every competitor until they either went bankrupt or sold to him. This was not business, this was war. And Cornelius Vanderbilt fought it with a clarity that most men never achieve. He understood that markets reward aggression, that customers do not care about fairness, that survival belongs to whoever is willing to work longer, charge less, and outlast everyone else. By 1846, Cornelius Vanderbilt had become a millionaire, not from luck, from consolidation. He understood something most men of his era did not, that scattered wealth is vulnerable wealth, that empires are built not by spreading resources but by concentrating them. While other ferry operators competed against each other, Vanderbilt bought them. While other businessmen diversified, Vanderbilt doubled down. He took every dollar he made and poured it back into dominance. When the California gold rush began in 1849, Vanderbilt didn't go west to dig. He built steamships to carry others. He profited from their dreams, from their desperation, from the fact that men will pay anything for a chance at fortune. He didn't need to believe in gold. He only needed to believe in human greed, and he was right. By the 1860s, Vanderbilt had shifted entirely into railroads. The steamship era was ending. The future belonged to steel and steam and tracks that connected cities. Vanderbilt saw it before most. He bought the New York Central Railroad and merged it with smaller lines, creating a transportation monopoly that stretched from New York to Chicago. He crushed competitors through price wars. He bribed legislators to block rival rail companies. He controlled shipping rates so tightly that entire industries had no choice but to pay his fees. Everything he touched, he consolidated. Everything he controlled, he held tight. And when he wrote his will, he followed the same principle. Of his $100 million estate, Cornelius gave over $80 million to his eldest son, William Henry. The rest was divided among his other children in token amounts. His second wife received almost nothing, his daughters even less. To the public it looked cruel. His other children were furious. They sued. They accused him of senility, of being manipulated by William, of betraying his own blood. The lawsuits dragged on for years. Cornelius didn't care. To him, fairness was irrelevant. He had not built an empire by being fair. He had built it by being singular, by refusing to let control fragment, by forcing all power into one hand. He believed that wealth, like a business, could only survive if someone owned it completely, not partially, not cooperatively, completely. And so he gave everything to William Henry, not because William was his favorite, but because William was the one he had trained, the one he had tested. So the one who had proven he could think like an empire builder instead of an heir. William Henry Vanderbilt was not his father's favorite son. For most of his early life, Cornelius doubted him, thought him too soft, too cautious, not ruthless enough to hold on to an empire. Cornelius had forced William to manage farms on Staten Island far from the family business. It was a test, a humiliation even. William spent years working land while his father built railroads, but William proved him wrong. He turned failing farms into profitable operations. He learned discipline, he learned patience. And when his father finally brought him into the railroad business, William ran it with precision. He didn't complain about the years of exile, he didn't demand recognition, he simply worked. And Cornelius, in his final years, realized that William was not soft, he was controlled. And control, Cornelius knew, was more valuable than aggression. When William inherited his father's 87% stake in the New York Central Railroad in 1877, he was 56 years old. Most men at that age slowed down. William accelerated. Within 8 years, he doubled the family fortune. By 1885, the Vanderbilt estate was worth over $200 million. William had expanded the rail network across the Midwest, invested in new lines, crushed competitors, and maintained the monopoly his father had built. He was a better manager than his father, more strategic, less impulsive. He didn't fight price wars for pride, he fought them to win, and he won consistently. But William also did something Cornelius never had. He gave money away, he endowed universities, he funded hospitals, he donated to churches and orphanages, and most visibly, he built the Vanderbilt block on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a row of massive limestone mansions that announced to the world that the Vanderbilts were not just rich, they were permanent, they were aristocracy. The mansions were French chateaux transplanted to New York, marble staircases, ballrooms that could hold hundreds, libraries filled with rare books, art imported from Europe. These were not homes, they were declarations. And Fifth Avenue, once a residential street for old merchant families, became Vanderbilt territory. But inside those mansions, William Henry Vanderbilt struggled with something his father never did. Doubt. He once said, "Inherited wealth is a real handicap to happiness." He meant it. William had watched his father hoard control. He had seen the resentment it caused among the other children, the lawsuits, the bitterness. The way his sisters had been excluded from the fortune. The way his brothers had been given just enough to survive but not enough to matter. And he had watched his father die alone, surrounded by lawyers instead of family. The Commodore's funeral had been grand, but it had not been warm, and William, despite all his success, did not want that. He wanted to be loved, he wanted his children to be happy, he wanted to be fair. And in 1885, when his own health began to fail, William Henry Vanderbilt made a decision. He would divide the fortune. He would not repeat his father's cruelty. He would give each of his children enough to live in comfort, enough to pursue their interests, enough to never resent him the way he had sometimes resented his own father. It seemed at the time like wisdom, like evolution. Like the mark of a man who had learned from the past. But it was a miscalculation, because William had confused generosity with strategy. He believed that love and wealth could coexist without discipline, that his children would remain united simply because they were family, that giving them freedom would not cost them their legacy. He was wrong. The will was signed in December 1885. William Henry Vanderbilt died a few days later at age 64 from a stroke. When the document was read, it revealed something no one expected. The $200 million fortune would not go to a single heir, it would be divided. His widow received a substantial share. His 9 children received shares. Charitable causes received millions. The 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William K., received the largest portions. But even they did not get enough to maintain sole control of the business. The rest was scattered. On paper, it looked generous, equitable, modern. In practice, it was a death sentence. Because William had violated the one rule his father had lived by, concentration of power, Cornelius Vanderbilt had built an empire by consolidating, by refusing to let wealth fragment, by forcing one son to carry the entire weight of the family legacy. William had chosen compassion instead, and the moment that will was executed, the Vanderbilt dynasty began to die, not loudly, not immediately, but irreversibly, because wealth does not care about intentions. It does not reward fairness, it follows the laws of gravity, and when you scatter it, it falls. Of all William Henry Vanderbilt's sons, only one tried to hold the empire together. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, he was the eldest, the most disciplined, the one who had been trained, like his father, to think in terms of legacy. When William died in 1885, Cornelius II inherited the largest share of the fortune and took control of the New York Central Railroad. He ran it well. For 14 years, Cornelius II managed the railroad with the same rigor his grandfather had. He expanded routes, he improved infrastructure, He kept the company profitable even as competition from other railroads intensified. He worked 12-hour days, he attended board meetings. He made decisions that prioritized the business over personal comfort. He was, in every sense, a steward. But he was alone in this. His brothers had no interest in the business. William Kissam Vanderbilt, the second son, cared only about luxury, yachts, mansions, social prestige. He threw parties that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. He commissioned a yacht called the Valiant that was longer than a city block. He married Alva Smith, a woman whose ambition was not to preserve the Vanderbilt fortune but to spend it in ways that would make European aristocrats jealous. And she succeeded. The costume ball she threw in 1883 became legendary, 1,200 guests, everyone in elaborate costumes. The newspapers covered it for weeks. It cost more than some small towns' annual budgets, and it accomplished exactly what Alva wanted. It made the Vanderbilts famous, not respected, famous. George Washington Vanderbilt, the youngest, cared about art and architecture. He collected books. He traveled through Europe buying paintings and sculptures. He spoke multiple languages. He was cultured in a way his grandfather would have found useless. And Cornelius II could not force them to care. Because the fortune had been divided, his brothers did not need the business. They had inherited enough to live without working, enough to build monuments to themselves. And that is exactly what they did. In 1895, George Washington Vanderbilt completed construction on Biltmore Estate. It was the largest privately owned home in America. 178,000 square feet, 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, set on 146,000 acres of North Carolina forest. It cost $6 million to build. For context, that was roughly 3% of the entire family fortune at the time. George Vanderbilt spent 3% of his inheritance on a single house. Not an investment, not a business, a house. He filled it with art, with tapestries imported from Europe, with a library of 23,000 books. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park, to design the grounds. He built a village on the property to house the staff. He installed electricity, an indoor pool, a bowling alley. Biltmore was beautiful. And it was a perfect symbol of what was happening to the Vanderbilt fortune. It was being turned into Dacre. George never married until late in life. He had no heirs for most of his adult years, and yet he built a house designed for dynasties. A house meant to last centuries, but dynasties require more than architecture. They require discipline, and George had none. He spent the rest of his life maintaining Biltmore, paying its taxes, hiring staff, importing more art. He died in 1914, having contributed nothing to the family business, having built nothing that generated wealth. He left behind a mansion that his daughter could not afford to keep. Within a generation, Biltmore would be open to tourists just to pay the bills. It still operates that way today. A monument to a man who confused beauty with legacy. Meanwhile, in New York, William Kissam Vanderbilt had built his own monument. A French château on 5th Avenue, 665th Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most expensive architect in America. Marble, limestone, gilded interiors, a ballroom that could host 400 guests. William K. lived there with Alva until their marriage collapsed. She had become bored with him. He had become bored with her. They divorced in 1895, a scandal in an era when divorce among the elite was rare. William K. remarried quickly, a younger woman. He spent his later years on yachts, racing cars, and traveling. He hosted regattas. He funded early automobile competitions. He lived like European royalty. And when Cornelius II died in 1899, William K. inherited his share of the railroad. He immediately handed control to outside managers. He had no interest in running a business. So the Vanderbilt empire, built by men who worked, was now owned by men who played. Cornelius II's death marked the end of active Vanderbilt leadership. He died at 55, worn out from stress. He had tried to hold the business together while his brothers spent freely. He had tried to instill discipline in the next generation. He had failed. His children inherited his sense of duty but not his wealth. Because by the time Cornelius II died, the fortune had already been divided too many times. His share, though substantial, was not enough to give his children the same power his grandfather had given his father. And so they became, like their uncles, ornamental. By the early 1900s, the Vanderbilt fortune was being managed by accountants, lawyers, and professional executives. The family itself had become ornamental. The fourth generation, Cornelius II's children, William K's children, George's daughter, inherited money without ever being taught how to preserve it. They had titles, they had mansions, they had trust funds, but they had no empire because there was nothing left to manage. The railroad industry itself was beginning to collapse. Automobiles were replacing trains for short-distance travel. Henry Ford had begun mass-producing cars. Trucks were replacing freight rail. Airlines were being developed. The Panama Canal had opened, creating new shipping routes that bypassed American railroads entirely. The New York Central Railroad, once the most powerful transportation company in America, was slowly becoming obsolete, and the Vanderbilts were not there to adapt it. They were in Europe on yachts, at parties. They summered in Newport, Rhode Island, where they built even more mansions. The Breakers, Marble House, Rough Point, each one more elaborate than the last. Each one a statement that the Vanderbilts were still relevant, still powerful, still American royalty, but relevance is not inherited, it is earned. And the fourth generation had earned nothing. They had only spent. One Vanderbilt heir later admitted, "Every Vanderbilt son has increased his fortune except me." He was speaking about himself, but he could have been speaking about all of them, because by the 1920s, the Vanderbilt fortune was no longer growing, it was evaporating. The Great Depression accelerated the collapse. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Fortunes built on speculation vanished overnight, but the Vanderbilts were not speculators. Their wealth was in railroads, in real estate, in tangible assets, and yet they suffered because their assets were expensive to maintain. The Fifth Avenue mansions required full-time staff, dozens of servants, heating costs, property taxes that increased every year as New York City grew. The Newport estates were even worse. Built for summer use only, they sat empty 9 months a year, but they still required maintenance. Groundskeepers, security, repairs. The Vanderbilts were spending millions annually just to keep their homes from falling apart. And the railroad was dying. By the 1930s, the New York Central was losing money. Passenger traffic had dropped. Freight contracts were being undercut by trucking companies. The federal government was investing in highways, not rail. And the Vanderbilt family, which once controlled 87% of the company, now controlled almost none of it. The shares had been divided so many times, sold so often to pay estate taxes and maintain lifestyles that the family had no voting power. No influence, they were shareholders in name only. And when the New York Central finally went bankrupt in 1971, absorbed into Amtrak, the Vanderbilts were not even consulted. The company their great-grandfather had built, the monopoly he had died protecting, gone, not because of external enemies, not because of government regulation, because the people who inherited it stopped caring. They had divided the wealth so many times that no one person had enough power to make decisions. No one felt responsible. And so the business, like the mansions, was torn down. In 1926, Cornelius Vanderbilt III tried to sell his Fifth Avenue mansion. It had been built by his grandfather, William Henry, in the 1880s. It was a symbol of the family's arrival into American aristocracy. He could not find a buyer. The property taxes alone were unsustainable. The cost of maintaining a 50-room mansion in Manhattan was more than the mansion itself was worth. In 1927, it was demolished. They tore it down and built a commercial building in its place. One by one, the other Vanderbilt mansions followed. William K's chateau was demolished in 1926. Cornelius II's mansion was demolished in 1927. The entire Vanderbilt block, which had once represented permanence, was gone within 2 years. By 1947, every single Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was gone, not sold to other families, not converted into museums, demolished. The grandest homes in New York built to last centuries survived less than 60 years because the people who built them had concentrated their wealth, and the people who inherited them had scattered it. The mansions had been symbols of power, but power requires fuel, and the Vanderbilts had run out. In 1973, the Vanderbilt family held a reunion at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt attended. Not a single one was a millionaire. Think about that. In 1885, the Vanderbilt family had controlled $200 million. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $5 billion today. 90 years later, spread across 120 people, the fortune had completely disappeared. No trust funds. No estates, no businesses. One of the attendees was a woman named Gloria Vanderbilt, a fashion designer, a celebrity in her own right. She had built her own career because she had no inheritance to rely on. Her son, Anderson Cooper, later said his mother made it clear to him, "There's no trust fund." The Vanderbilt name survived, but the Vanderbilt fortune did not. The story of the Vanderbilt collapse is not a tragedy. Tragedies happen to people who did nothing wrong. The Vanderbilts made a choice. In 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt chose to divide his fortune equally among his children. He did it out of love, out of fairness, out of a desire to avoid the resentment his father had created. And that choice destroyed everything, because wealth is not neutral. It does not sit still. It does not wait politely while heirs decide what to do with it. Wealth is a force, and like any force, it requires direction, control, discipline. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood this. He built an empire by refusing to let control fragment, by forcing his wealth into a single point of pressure, by making one son carry the entire weight of the family legacy. It was cruel. His other children hated him for it, but it worked. William Henry Vanderbilt did not. He scattered the pressure, he divided the control, and in doing so, he turned a dynasty into 100 separate bank accounts. His children had no reason to work together, no shared purpose, no unified leadership. They had only money, and money alone does not preserve itself. If you study the Vanderbilt collapse, 3 mistakes become clear. First, they divided control. When William split the fortune, he destroyed the very thing that had made it powerful: concentration. His father had given him 87% of the company, enough to make unilateral decisions, enough to be a dictator. William gave his sons 20% each, enough to be rich, not enough to lead, and so no one led. The New York Central Railroad, once run by a single family with absolute authority, became a committee. And committees do not build empires. They manage decline. Second, they raised heirs without responsibility. Cornelius had trained William by forcing him to manage farms, oversee businesses, make decisions that mattered. He had exiled William from the family business for years, not out of cruelty, but to see if William could build something on his own. And William had. He had turned failing farms into profitable operations. He had proven that he could create wealth, not just inherit it. But William did not do the same for his sons. He raised them in mansions. He gave them tutors, servants, trust funds. He gave them everything except the one thing that mattered, the expectation that they would carry the weight of the family. By the 3rd generation, Vanderbilt children did not know how to build. They only knew how to spend. They had been raised as aristocrats, but aristocracy in America is a performance. It requires constant wealth to sustain. And the Vanderbilts, by the 3rd generation, were no longer creating wealth. Third, they built monuments instead of systems. Biltmore Estate is still standing today. It is a tourist attraction. You can pay $20 to walk through George Vanderbilt's library. You can see the art he collected, the tapestries he imported, the bowling alley he installed. It is beautiful, and it is meaningless because beauty does not compound. The New York Central Railroad is gone, the company that actually generated wealth, the business that employed thousands, the monopoly that connected cities. Gone because the Vanderbilts spent millions on houses, yachts, and parties, and they spent almost nothing on trusts, governance structures, or long-term financial planning. They built symbols of wealth. They did not build systems to preserve it. William Henry Vanderbilt loved his children. That is not in question. He wanted them to be happy. He wanted them to avoid the bitterness that had poisoned his own childhood. And so he gave them equality. He gave them freedom. He gave them enough money to never need him, and in doing so, he gave them nothing that would last, because a dynasty is not built on kindness. It is built on weight, the weight of responsibility, the weight of expectation. The weight of knowing that you are carrying something larger than yourself. Cornelius Vanderbilt forced his son to carry that weight. He gave William no choice. He gave him $80 million and the expectation that he would double it. And William did, because he had no alternative, because the weight made him strong. William Henry Vanderbilt lifted that weight from his children. He divided the fortune so that no single child would feel the pressure his father had placed on him. He thought he was being merciful. He thought he was evolving past his father's cruelty. But pressure is what creates diamonds, and without it, his children became decorative. They became consumers. They became the fourth generation that lost everything. Because when the weight was gone, so was the discipline. And when the discipline was gone, so was the dynasty. Today, the Vanderbilt name exists on universities, hospital wings, and historical plaques. Vanderbilt University in Nashville still carries the name. So does a medical center, so do a few streets in Manhattan, but the fortune is gone. The mansions are gone, the business is gone, all that remains is a lesson that great wealth requires great discipline, that empires are not inherited, they are maintained. And that sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for your children is to force them to be strong enough to survive what you leave behind. The irony is that William Henry Vanderbilt knew this. His father had told him directly, "Any fool can make a fortune, it takes a man of brains to hold onto it." William had proven he had the brains, he had doubled the fortune, he had expanded the empire, he had done everything right except the one thing that mattered. He had not prepared his children to do the same. He had loved them too much to burden them, and in doing so he had condemned them not immediately, but inevitably. Because wealth is not a gift, it is a test. It tests character, it tests discipline, it tests whether you are strong enough to carry something that wants to fall apart. Cornelius Vanderbilt passed that test. William Henry Vanderbilt passed that test, but neither of them built a system that would allow future generations to pass it. They relied on individual strength, and when that strength was not passed down, the empire collapsed. Not because of outside forces, not because of bad luck, but because inheritance without responsibility is just a slower form of bankruptcy. The Vanderbilts had 120 descendants at their 1973 reunion. If William Henry Vanderbilt had kept the fortune concentrated, if he had given it all to Cornelius II and demanded that Cornelius II do the same, perhaps one branch of the family would still be wealthy. Perhaps the New York Central Railroad would still be family-controlled. Perhaps the mansions would still stand. But that is not what happened. What happened is that compassion destroyed what cruelty had built, and the Vanderbilts, once the richest family in America, became a cautionary tale. A name on buildings that no longer belonged to them, a case study in how not to preserve wealth, and a reminder that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that matter most. William Henry Vanderbilt thought he was protecting his family. He thought he was giving them freedom. He thought he was evolving past the brutality of his father's generation. But he was wrong. He was not protecting them. He was sentencing them to irrelevance. And by the time anyone realized it, it was too late. The fortune was scattered. The business was lost. The dynasty was over. And all that remained was the lesson that wealth does not care about intentions. It only cares about discipline. And the Vanderbilts, in their kindness, forgot that.